Almost half the world's population is in lockdown. The volume of confirmed cases has risen at a dramatic rate, and so has the number of fatalities. Novel coronavirus, or COVID-19, has spread across the globe with devastating effect. Thermo Fisher Scientific's scale and depth of capabilities have never been more vital, and our mission? To enable our customers to make the world healthier, cleaner, and safer has never been more important. But let's take a look back. The first case of COVID-19 was reported in Wuhan, China in December 2019, and we were there. On January 6th, our Thermo Scientific Techni Spirit transmission electron microscope was used to characterize the pathogen. Over 1,200 boxes of our reagents and assays were then fast-tracked so researchers could rapidly develop tests. Meanwhile, scientists in Australia used our Applied Biosystems Seq Studio instrument to sequence the virus's genome and provide the roadmap for a diagnostic test. On January 30th, the World Health Organization declared a global emergency, and we were there. Our Thermo Scientific Krios electron microscope was used by a team of researchers from the US to show the first three-dimensional structure of the coronavirus spike protein, key to understanding how to target the virus. By February 19th, 14,000 new cases were reported in Hubei province, and we were there. In March, the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 to be a pandemic. Our real-time PCR test, which diagnoses the virus in 4 hours, was authorized by the US FDA for emergency use. It then received the CE mark in Europe, and now nearly 50 countries are authorized to use our test, which is considered the gold standard. As the virus spreads globally, we are producing more than 5 million of our COVID-19 diagnostic tests per week. At Thermo Fisher Scientific, we remain at the forefront of the fight against coronavirus. We're providing personal protective equipment to keep healthcare workers safe. We're modifying our production lines to make components for ventilators and produce hand sanitizer. As we look ahead, we're collaborating with pharma and biotech customers to develop treatments for the virus, and we're helping them identify and ultimately produce COVID-19 vaccines. And that's just the start. There's a long way to go. But as one team, committed to our mission, we will prevail. We have much to be proud of.
Hey everybody, greetings. I'm Gary Olson, Director of Biolabs at the Lundquist Institute in Torrance, California. Hopefully you're having a great BCLA 2020 Biotech Summit so far. And unfortunately, since we can't be in person, I wanted to come to you virtually to talk a little bit about who we are and what we do. Biolabs is a network of co-working incubation spaces across the US. We just announced our newest location in Dallas coming in 2021. We're very excited to be expanding the whole breadth of the United States. But we are a network made up of about 300 member companies, which thrives on providing premium lab spaces for life science startups. We enable our members and our entrepreneurs to really network with each other so that they can find collaborations across the board and really help them get across hurdles that they may be coming up against as they go down the adventure of being an entrepreneur and having a startup. Here in LA specifically, we opened about a year ago in May, and we are currently about 21 members strong, which is about 50%. We have office space, we have private labs, we have lab benches by the bench in a community lab area. We have about 1.5 million of shared equipment, and we really help you take care of all the things beyond the science. We let you focus on the science, and we kind of handle everything else, whether that's providing concierge services for shipping or just helping you find an international tax accountant. You name it, we're there to help you. When none of this would be possible without our sponsors and our partner, the Lundquist Institute, who I'll talk about shortly, and our sponsors that have a wide breadth of experiences and technologies that they're able to support us with, whether that's equipment through such sponsors as Thermo Fisher, Millipore, and our newest sponsor, Gemini Bio, but also through our non-equipment sponsors such as Wilson Sonsini and Biocom. They allow us to find the network to help tap into locally that gets you what you need to really thrive and be successful. Our partner, as I mentioned, is the Lundquist Institute. They really saw a need for innovation in LA and wanted to be part of that new revolution, and put a lot of effort in combining with the county and the Lundquist themselves to really open an innovation space in their newest building on campus. The Lundquist Institute has a long and rich history in the South Bay, about 68 years of innovation, where they are really turning the tide on translational research in connection with the Harbor UCLA Medical Center. And as you can see here, so many achievements have come out that you use daily and don't even realize. The cholesterol test, the field of paramedics, for instance. They also are very proliferative in their research. They're putting out about a paper a day, which is amazing for a small nonprofit research organization. So hopefully you get a chance to check out the Lundquist Institute as well as Biolabs LA in the near future. We have been doing our part to keep up and step up in this time, this awkward and unusual time of COVID. We've had many companies pivot, and it's great to see the ingenuity that they come up with to tackle this from another perspective using their technology that they already have. We've been able to stay open this entire time, which has been great for companies that maybe were looking for temporary space to squat in while their own organizations figured out how to proceed. So we're pretty proud of our efforts so far, and of course, putting up all the barriers and being extra safe and cautious in this space has really allowed us to stay open and not have any issues. So we are excited to work with our companies to allow them to continue and have their business continuity going, and really be part of that process, because science and teams will solve this. And so we're excited to help them help everyone else. Thank you so much. Again, I look forward to meeting you all hopefully someday. And if not, reach out to me virtually, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. I hope everyone has enjoyed our opening remarks and keynotes by Rick Burke of Stat News. Welcome to panel 1 of our 6th annual Biotech Summit. Thank you everyone for joining us today. First, I'd really like to thank our sponsors for their continued support in our effort to grow and diversify the biotech community here in Los Angeles. Support that makes events like this possible. And so we here at BCLA try to make possible is to provide a space to inspire, to educate, and connect the biotech community. And this year has been unprecedented and has made it even more crucial for us to continue to advance our understanding and our compassion for diversity and equality issues facing our biotech industry and our communities. And so we are extremely pleased to bring you this panel, Inequity in Healthcare, the Impact of COVID-19 on LA's Communities of Color, to support us all in understanding existing inequities in healthcare and talk about current strategies through the diverse voices of our amazing panelists. So let me briefly introduce the team that put this together. I'll then introduce our amazing moderator, and we'll get this panel started. So I'll start off with Sanna Rao. She is a PhD candidate in neuroscience at USC and our lead outreach associate at BCLA. Yolanda Pierce is a neuroscientist, postdoctoral research fellow at Lundquist Institute for the Biomedical Innovation, and is also our media associate at BCLA. And I'm Angel Gonzalez. I am a microbiomics researcher focused on developing applications in next-gen sequencing at Zymo Research, and also a social media associate at BCLA. And I'm thrilled to have our amazing moderator, Yordanos Gepertatios. She has recently served as the executive director of LA Bioscience Hub, a geographically focused nonprofit working to create a vibrant bioscience cluster in LA's east side. Yordanos has expertise in launching and expanding workforce training opportunities that help underserved students start their careers in the life sciences. Previously, Yordanos has led physician workforce development for LA Care Health Plan. And before that, she worked in a research institute at Johns Hopkins on biotech solutions to fight pneumonia. Yordanos has received her Master's of Public Health from Johns Hopkins and her BA in Bioscience from Rice University. So we're extremely thrilled again, and I'll hand it off to Yordanos to introduce our amazing panelists and get this important discussion started.
Thank you, Angel. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this panel, The Impact of COVID-19 on LA's Communities of Color, as part of the BCLA Annual Summit. My name is Jordanos Garatatios, and I am so pleased to serve as the moderator for this discussion. As we continue to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, evidence is mounting that racial and ethnic minorities are bearing a disproportionate burden of illness and death. If we look at the pandemic response on a continuum from disease exposure to clinical care to clinical trial research, we see poorer health outcomes at each stage for populations of color when compared to white populations. We have our panel here today to share their insights about why this is and to share approaches to reduce these disparities. So I'd like to introduce our panelists now. We have Dr. Katia Corrado, who is a physician that provides primary care to HIV patients at Tom K Clinic in Long Beach. She is also an investigator at Lundquist Institute working on recruiting populations of color for COVID vaccine trials. She's a graduate of the Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA, completed her internal medicine residency at Harbor UCLA Medical Center, and her infectious disease fellowship at the University of New Mexico. We also have Dr. Tucker Seeley, who is an assistant professor in the USC Leonard David School of Gerontology and the inaugural holder of the Edward Schneider Chair in Gerontology. He manages the Tucker Seeley Research Lab, and he completed his master and doctoral degrees in public health at the Harvard School of Public Health and a postdoctoral fellowship in cancer prevention. Carmen Ibarra is the Chief Executive Officer at the Achievable Foundation, a community health center providing high-quality healthcare to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families. Prior to Achievable, Carmen served as the CEO of Pomona Community Health Center, and prior to that, the COO of Venice Family Clinic. Carmen is also the board chair of the Community Clinic Association of LA County. And last but not least, we have Dr. Jones-Lopez, who is an infectious disease specialist and assistant professor of clinical medicine at Keck School of Medicine at USC. He is a co-investigator on COVID-19 trials, testing the experimental vaccine AZD1222 from AstraZeneca, which aims to recruit 300 volunteers as part of a nationwide research effort involving 30,000 volunteers. So thank you to our panelists for being here today. So let's dive right into the questions. The first question is actually posed to all of our panelists, since we do have a diverse perspectives here from clinicians, researchers, academic administrators. So from each of your perspectives and what you see in the work that you do, what are some of the factors that put racial and ethnic minority groups at increased risk of getting sick and dying from COVID-19? Dr. Corrado, would you kick us off?
Of course, thank you so much for having me. So there's a lot of ways that question can be answered, but one of the major ways that we need to think about this issue is that when we still have a current infrastructure where we rely on safety net systems, much like the one I work in, I should say, this should be considered a major obstacle, right? So I proudly work in a safety net hospital, but by the time patients arrive to me, there have been many missed opportunities for care, many missed opportunities to curtail the disease progression. And so we need to focus on making sure that there is access to healthcare, insurance. If someone does have insurance, how do they maneuver the healthcare system? Also, immigration status is such a big deal for our communities, along with also having prior negative healthcare experiences that may curtail again their or may not allow them to access healthcare as much as they should. I'll pause there and let someone else talk.
Yeah. Dr. Jones-Lopez, would you like to add to that in terms of factors that you see in your work that put these groups at increased risk?
Sure. I wanted to also thank you for inviting me for this panel. I think this is an incredible exercise, really. You know, I think this is obviously a very complicated theme, multi-layered. And I want to make an analogy with COVID, with the disease that I've studied for the last 25 years, which is tuberculosis. And I make the analogy for several reasons. One is it's also airborne. Two, it tends to accumulate among underserved populations, not only in this country, but throughout the world. And it aggregates at a family level because of its airborne nature. And to this day, tuberculosis kills more people than any other infectious disease, and it has always killed historically more people than any other infectious disease. And yet we still do not understand it. There's still very limited treatment options. There's no vaccine, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know? And that's why I like to make this comparison, because obviously this is a very different disease, a very modern disease, also very complicated, we're turning out to understand, but it's in the same way accumulating among really underserved populations. And it has, again, a lot of levels to this. And obviously we will discuss these different layers and levels in this talk. I hope we can go into it. So as my introductory remark, I would stay there.
I think we all agree it's multifactorial. But from each of your experiences, maybe the kind of things that you're bumping up against the most. Dr. Tucker-Seeley, could you share some of the factors that you've seen that really put racial and ethnic minority groups at increased risk with this particular disease?
So a disease where I've worked primarily is cancer, but I appreciate the other diseases that were mentioned as well, because they give us examples to think about in terms of where racial and ethnic minorities are also generally fare worse. So the example by Dr. Jones-Lopez of tuberculosis, and then Dr. Carrada mentioned her work in HIV. And across these conditions, we see that racial and ethnic minorities and individuals with fewer socioeconomic resources generally fare worse. And so from the field that I trained, called social epidemiology, we talk a lot about this notion of fundamental causes. So that is what puts people at risk of risk. And generally we can think about those things in terms of knowledge, power, prestige, beneficial social connections, and financial resources. So thinking about who has those things, because those are the things that we use to protect ourselves when we confront any, right now with COVID, any sort of, health challenge or sort of health issue. We use the knowledge that we have to make different or better kinds of health related decisions. We use the prestige and power of our respective, occupations. So for example, with COVID as an example, for those of us who have an occupation that allows us to work from home, our risk of contracting COVID is different for people than those who don't necessarily have those types of occupations. And so if we think across those things that put people at risk of being at risk for the disease, I think that helps us to explain why consistently across multiple diseases, we see similar groups having worse health outcomes.
And Carmen, from your experience at Community Clinic Association and also at the Chivo Bulb Foundation, are there any other factors that you kind of see at play here with COVID-19?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing that I see is right now, especially with public health, is that it's become such a politicized issue. How you address this pandemic has become an issue of, are you a Democrat or a Republican? And it really shouldn't be that way. It should be, it's a public health issue that we need to look at it just from that perspective. And so I see that as the big issue. And Dr. Corrado mentioned how we're relying on addressing this from a safety net perspective a lot of times. However, the infrastructure is not there in many ways. We've had significant challenges in being able to get PPE, just like the hospitals and everybody else. But The community health centers are the places that people typically go to first, or there's an established relationship, there is a comfort level, there's a sense of safety, especially for immigrant communities, where sometimes that becomes a real issue. But yet we didn't have really what we needed to address things effectively. PPE is a prime example of that. We had to change also from one day to the next to being able to provide visits in a virtual format. And, you know, this has brought on other items to really, you know, that have been a critical issue before, but it just, you know, was more pronounced as this change occurred. And that's around the issues of digital divide. You know, it's not just a rural area issue. We've seen it in LA County, and it's a real significant problem for many communities of color in a low socioeconomic status. And then the other thing that I you know, in terms of the safety net, is that you know, until recently, as an example, at my community health center, we were only given 5 kits to test for COVID. So, and this was for months and months. And so needless to say, we ran out of those 5 kits very rapidly, and we couldn't get access to more. So even though we want to help our patients and we want to help the community, we're often restricted by the lack of infrastructure and supplies and resources and capacity that exists in the county.
I wanted to pose this question to you all first, because I think it's a table setting question. You know, we've identified access to health insurance, healthcare access and utilization, occupation, immigration status, education, housing, and just the general politicization of all of this, that I think we're going to be able to dive into much deeper in terms of all these factors that put racial and ethnic minority groups at increased risk. But I want to kind of pan out to 30,000 feet and ask about the policy world. So this question, I'll start with you, Dr. Tucker-Seeley, and also Carmen, but how has COVID-19 impacted policy making around health inequalities?
I think that's a great question. I think that the challenge Carmen raised earlier is the politicization of this process. You know, I think the lack of a clear strategy at the federal level, and the way in which the virus has been communicated. So there's been shifting descriptions of the severity of the virus from the federal government, and also permission to not follow public health guidelines. So if the leader of a country is not following the guidelines of his health minister, or, you know, the main public health agency of that country, I think that presents a substantial problem at lower levels of government in their attempts to address the pandemic. And so I think that's been just the biggest impact on policymaking. We did see our policymakers come together pretty quickly to initially provide some sort of financial support for households. But as we've seen, as we've continued to navigate through the pandemic, many of us are just 1 to 2 paychecks away from a financial catastrophe. And so that one sort of stimulus check is not something that can sustain our households. So we're seeing, you know, our policymakers not necessarily really come to the table to address these issues in a way that I think that they should.
Carmen, is there anything that you would like to add?
I agree. I think initially there was a very quick response, and it was a response that was needed to really remove many of the barriers and the red tape that exists. A perfect example was with the issue that I raised with telehealth. You know, we've been talking about telehealth for years, and from one day to the next, it happened. Because everything was removed, all the red tape, certain restrictions, for example, on community health centers and being able to provide services in this virtual way. they were gone. So we've made some, I think, good strides, and I think that the conversation has really opened up about the inequities that exist along racial and ethnic lines, and the haves and the have-nots, right? But as I mentioned, there are a lot of steps backwards that we take. There has been a recent executive order by the president, for example, that restricts those that receive federal funding to talk about certain issues and use certain verbiage. Intersectionality is one of those words that seem to be on the no use list. And so technically, I shouldn't be using that word right now. So I'm going to refer to our discussion here about health disparities. I'm going to talk about, social determinants of health, all those factors without using that particular word. Because our federal funding could be really impacted, if I continue along those lines of conversation. However, all we need to do is look at the statistics, really, to see what's really occurring. So there are, though, especially in California, some key issues in policymaking that is, I think, setting a good precedence. And so hopefully it leads to long-term systemic change. And let me just list those. One is SB 1159 and AB 685. So one of them ensures that workers are notified if there is a COVID outbreak in the work setting. So that's a real good thing, because you know that especially with people of color, this has been a real issue where they're forced to go to work, they can't take a day off, and they haven't been informed that there is an outbreak, and so they don't have the protective equipment and supplies that they need. So this has been an issue. And then also the other one will allow people to get workers' comp if there's a likelihood that they got the disease from work. So I think the main thing then with that is that then they have access to health care to treat whatever may be going on. So those are great things. And then the other thing that has been changed recently along policy and really addressing COVID specifically is the equity requirement that was just this month put in effect in California, where you cannot ease, or a county or a city cannot ease restrictions until the population that's been most impacted by this disease has met that minimum threshold to ease restrictions. So I think then it encourages communities, cities, counties to really invest in the most vulnerable populations and the most impacted populations.
Thank you. That is a really great overview of the policy. I know in the start of the pandemic, there was so many disparate messages coming and so many different policies that it made everything very confusing, tumultuous. So it's good now that there's kind of some stability and that we see these like the telehealth being much more accessible to people.
Yes.
I think too, it should be highlighted that last policy that Carmen mentioned, sort of the uniqueness of that policy, because one question that's often asked, especially in disparities related research, is when is the difference actionable? Or how big does the difference have to be described as a disparity? And I think that policy that Carmen described encourages us to actually act on the disparities that we see. And that is for the populations that are most or hardest hit, that's where the targeted effort should be to ensure that prior to opening up, that those populations are seeing the benefits of the proposals as well.
I also wanted to make a quick comment. It's important to recognize that some of the issues that have been brought up, and I cannot agree more with them, actually are very, if not exclusive, they're very specific to this country. And they reflect very clear long-term political choices that have been made in this country. And a lot of the things we are discussing and we will go into hopefully are very applicable to the US almost exclusively when you compare it to other countries, high income countries, high educational countries that have other options of doing things differently. And many of the statistics that we now are very comfortable with in terms of the number of cases, the number of deaths, the difficulty, economic difficulties this has created, and a long list of other things are very, very different in many other countries, if not most of the other high income countries in the world. And this is a direct result. And it's obviously, I would say, not a single government. It's really a combination of decisions over decades, really, that have put up, that have really created a structure that is what we are, in essence, living. No? The most obvious one is obviously this issue of, healthcare. It's really by far the only large, rich country, democracy in particular, that does not have universal healthcare. And the absence of universal healthcare in a problem like this one it's almost impossible to deal with, really. And that goes to the heart of the matter, the discussion. Who are the people who are less likely to have healthcare, are precisely the people we are discussing.
And this is for anyone on the panel, do you think that the issue of universal healthcare is going to be much more of a priority as a result of the pandemic? Because we can see what happens when we're going through a crisis situation.
I mean, I can try and answer this. And again, these are incredibly complicated discussions. I think I would want to make a comparison here, with, I'm sure all of us remember another policy that I think is not directly related to all these issues, but it creates a lot of havoc at a different level, which is the policy of guns. And I remember the shooting in when I think it was in Connecticut, where
Sandy Hook.
Yeah, Sandy Hook. It was an obvious moment of national grief and international grief, really. And a lot of people thought that was going to be a moment where things would change, just the introduction of very obvious, very relatively simple, logical things, and it just didn't happen. So to answer your question, yes, you would want to think, there's two parts to healthcare issue. One is the reality that there's tens of millions of people who do not have access to healthcare other than a quick visit to the ER, which is, sold as a humanitarian thing, but it really does not provide, any solution whatsoever. And then the second is linking healthcare to work. And that's what this pandemic has really exposed. That link to work is what has caused this double whammy, frankly, of adding one thing to the other. And that is what has caused the double epidemic of health plus, tens of millions of unemployed people. And both of those numbers are very, very different in most of Europe, most of Asian countries, in other, relatively rich democratic countries.
In my opinion, really, healthcare has truly become here in this country a manifestation of the haves and the have-nots, at least access to healthcare. And we see this with the really growing popularity of concierge medicine, right? Where there is more of a tendency for those that have to buy into this specialty access of primary health care in other specialties. But so it's really hard when you have that type of model that keeps growing for people to really let go of the belief that if others have excellent access to appropriate health care, that it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to give up what they have currently. And so, you know, everybody should have the same level of access. It doesn't mean that you have to come down to a certain level of less services, less what have you. It just means that everybody's brought up to that same level. And so until we change that mentality, I think it's going to be very difficult for us to do. And also to really, I mean, one of the biggest factors comes down to money in terms of who's going to pay for it and how. So those are some significant barriers. I would love to move in that direction, but they are some very significant barriers that we have.
Yes, absolutely. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about clinical trials. I know that everyone is experiencing, you know, COVID fatigue and is really hopeful of a vaccine. But this question is for Dr. Corrado and Dr. Jones-Lopez. Why are racial and ethnic minorities significantly less likely than non-Hispanic whites to enroll in clinical trials? And what have you found to be some methods to meaningfully engage and enroll people in clinical trials? So Dr. Corrado, would you mind
First, I can go first. So, so this question is, again, as all your questions are very complex, but we need to acknowledge the complex relationship that exists between communities of color and the medical community. And the medical community also equates with the people who are investigators, right? So the clinical trials community. Because when we understand this, then we can acknowledge that there's a lot of work that we need to do on our end to make up the mistrust that exists in our communities of color. So what does this entail? So this entails years of establishing relationships within those communities, right? Within the Latinx, the Black communities. And we do this especially by having representation in our studies. So everywhere from not only your investigator, but also from protocol development to execution, we need to have representatives of the community involved, because then we then can go to our own communities and transmit the information in the language that is necessary, in the cultural appropriateness that is necessary, so that we can make our community understand this is the reason this is important. This is the reason you don't have to be afraid of us. And I have been here and I will be here with you through this and after this. So those are a couple of the things that come to mind. Also, I know it's been mentioned on the panel before, having clear messaging, clear and transparent, having clear messaging and being very transparent in what we're doing will, I think, go a long way in making up this mistrust that we have created and that we need to bridge.
Yes, absolutely. That the trust issue is a huge piece. And Dr. Jones-Lopez, what have you found as some methods for engaging and enrolling communities of color in clinical trials? And are there any other barriers in addition to the trust issue?
Yeah, I agree with what Dr. Corrado said. I mean, this is a particularly both important and far-reaching question. I would explain it in different ways, slightly different way. I think there's allopathic medicine, which is really what we're talking about here, the scientific modern medicine that has really generated the knowledge where we sit on, and really the possibility of treating with medications and vaccines, et cetera, has really had a very utilitarian approach, historically speaking. And over the last 50, 70 years, really, even before that. But in particular over the last, now things have changed, and I want to touch on that, but, you know, let's say 30 years ago and before that, really there was a lot of, and this not only happened in the US. The Nazis, for example, are famous for having really used populations to experiment on them, and in different ways, but the same thing happened here in other countries, where underserved, underrepresented populations were really experimented on in very unethical ways. And that created an enormous message. There's many famous examples. The most famous example is Tuskegee, which a lot of African Americans will tell you immediately when you ask them to. They use that word, they know that word almost by heart, and it's transmitted generation to generation to generation. And that cannot be, that particular issue cannot be, argued away. When you have that level of mistrust, when your grandfather and your great-grandmother told you about this particular study that really was, and others, that's not the only one, that was really cruel in many ways. So the historical part is the basis of a lot of it, in particular as it relates to African Americans. Now, what I can tell you now is that there's been that recognition of enormous damage done over many, many decades. This is really at a global level, not only in the US, but the US has been particularly good in addressing that issue. And at the highest levels of government, including in particular the NIH, the CDC, and others, have really put many systems in place now, multiple layers of systems, to completely eliminate that issue. And I have to say, research nowadays, modern research in the US in particular, is incredibly equitable. And actually, a lot of the studies we are trying to do, one of the major objectives is to precisely enroll minorities, because research is about distributing risks and benefits and applicability of data. And if you do not have a sufficient number of people, Latinx people or African Americans or Asians or whatever, a positive or a negative result on a particular study for whatever it is, a medication, a vaccine, we don't know if it's applicable to that particular population. So it's a key element. Actually, there's, in the very recent, as it relates to COVID, the first vaccine trial actually had to be paused. I'm sure you've read about this in the papers, had to be paused because they had not enrolled the required or the desirable proportion or number of underserved populations. So this is really now something that is very much in our minds, and there are many, many different efforts at different levels, from communication to explanation of benefits and risks, and it's a long list of things, to really recruit as many as possible, really, underserved populations across the board. Really, what you want is really a bit of everyone that is part of the society, in essence.
Carmen, this question is for you. How do you think that COVID-19 is affecting trust in the healthcare system for communities of color?
I'm not sure that I've seen any change, either in terms of improvement or worsening, from my perspective. I think there are certain areas there is a significant amount of trust, and I think you can see it with community health centers and people that tend to go to community health centers feel a certain level of safety there, and so we are where people normally go and get their health care and feel comfortable with it. But there is, as has been mentioned, still a great deal of distrust in the healthcare system. There are, especially kind of the individuals that I think are now having to access services in community health centers that maybe before were employed and had their insurance through their employers, that now, because all of their benefits are ending, they're ending up in community health centers. And so they feel that the system has let them down, not because they're having to receive care at community health centers, but because they worked hard to get to a certain place, to be self-sufficient, to provide for their families, and to be able to provide them health care through their workers, their work insurance. And now all of a sudden everything's gone. So I think there is still, with those that are kind of new to the community health center world, I think there's a larger level of distrust, but also appreciate the fact that they were able to find somewhere to access healthcare despite their recent loss. So there's a lot of work to be done, I think, at all levels to continue building that trust and removing some of this historical distrust that exists that Dr. Jones-Lopez has so well expressed in terms of historical issues that have occurred in this country with African Americans. We're seeing also with the Latinx community. You take the examples of individuals that have been incarcerated as because they came here without legal paperwork to come over, and women have had hysterectomies without their consent. So there's plenty of examples out there, and those are the things that we really, all of us at all different levels, have to work to improve that. What we've done historically and continue to do in many ways. And so it takes a village to really change this at all different levels, so through policy, through action, and really sincerity as we approach people.
Yes.
May I add to that?
Mm-hmm.
So I do want to be optimistic about this because again, working at a safety net hospital, we have shown that we're able to respond to this healthcare crisis without having patients die on our doorstep, right? Because everyone was so concerned that we were going to have enough ventilators and things of that nature. We've also been able to fight for medications such as remdesivir, as well as other investigational therapies that we're getting through clinical trials that even our president has access to, right? And so patients who have, unfortunately, have to come to our safety net hospitals and been hospitalized and fighting COVID-19, I think they're seeing that we are here and we're trying to give the best therapy possible. And I do think there is some trust built from that, from people who have come to our doors.
Yep, I think too, to piggyback on that last statement, it's important that the engagement with the community is genuine. The engagement with the community is real, and that it's not perceived as what's termed in the literature as token engagement. So those of us who are researchers are very familiar with, the helicopter researcher that'll come into a community, get the data that they need, and then they're gone, and the community members don't see them again. So it's important that the folks in the community trust the researchers in a way to where they know that those researchers are going to be there for them. The research around trust generally shows that individuals will trust their respective physician, but they may not necessarily trust the overall health system. And so I think we have to figure out ways to do that cross-level, or to create that cross-level trust, where the trust for the individual physician sort of will translate to the trust in the healthcare system.
Dr. Tucker-Seeley, is there an opportunity for collaboration with researchers? I mean, this is obviously not just a health and research thing, it's multi-sector. Mm-hmm. Have you seen any examples of collaborations or partnerships that help?
Yes, I think it's important that that community members are viewed as equal partners in the relationship effort. I think oftentimes we as researchers will come into communities thinking that we know the best questions to ask and we know how to answer them. And so we tell the community members what we're going to research, as opposed to going into the community and saying, what are your issues and how can we help? And I think in those kinds of partnerships, I think that's where you see the most success stories. And also, we as researchers are generally paid for our actions or our efforts on research studies, actually providing some sort of compensation for community members that are participating in these research efforts. Oftentimes you'll see community members serving in advisory roles or on advisory committees, but that takes time. And so ensuring that the individuals are compensated for their time to participate in those efforts as they are part of the research team. And I've also seen, I've been part of grant review panels that included advocates or people from the community that were equal partners or part of those review panels just as much, and their voice mattered just as much as the researchers' voices. And so I think, making sure that the community members are at the table when the decision is made to engage in that research, and they're not brought to the table after the entire research protocol has been put together.
We have a number of questions from the audience, actually quite a few about universal healthcare. So I'm going to jump into our audience questions. And I'll open this up to any of our panelists to address, but one of our questions, what are some short-term solutions to alleviate the issues associated with the absence of universal healthcare?
Right, so I can't speak to how we solve all problems in, in this short amount of time, but specifically for this pandemic, for COVID-19, access to testing, access to a healthcare facility that will evaluate the patient, having access to clinical trials that will study vaccines, that will study treatment as well, our community should have access to. And really, it's about messaging about how to keep safe, who is at highest risk, and like others in this panel have mentioned, not politicizing this disease.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I can also add to that. So I unfortunately, I don't think there's a short-term solution here. Frankly, healthcare is a very complicated and expensive endeavor, and it has it really is a spectrum of services that you need to think of. Preventive services are obviously key, and the stronger they are, the more healthy the general population will be. So that not accessing prevention services, and there's a long list of those, and many of them are age dependent, is an absolute disaster in terms of cumulative population health. The second level I would say is emergency care, emergency care in COVID is related to a lot, is at the center of that, of trying to determine if someone who has symptoms has COVID, yes or not, or in the next few weeks, unfortunately, flu. That's going to be a big issue, trying to separate those two, and they can coexist, obviously. But the more complicated issue, and that's why I think there's no short-term solutions, is really about establishing a long-term care situation, which is really what we all need. And as we age, the more we start becoming almost dependent on long care. And that's where, the comments about establishing a direct relationship with one physician or a group of physicians is key to really providing the best, care possible. And those groups of physicians are the ones who are going to be able to connect the lay people to the very complicated and sometimes very expensive and cruel health system, right? And it really has to be by design and a philosophical issue about wanting to really offer every single person that lives in this country healthcare. There's really no way around it. It's been tried, different patchwork solutions have been tried for decades and decades, and one works a little better than the other, but it's at the end of the day, there's tens of millions of people who have no access, and many others, many more, that have access to limited health care.
Yeah, I think for me, I would say there is some small short-term solutions, but I definitely agree that we have to look at what will be long-term changes that we need to have. One of those short-term solutions is to continue community health centers, allow them to provide telehealth services. It does increase access. People that need to go to work still can do a quick telehealth visit, either by video or by phone. And so those are some of the things that I think should continue beyond COVID. We did a survey of our patients, and 80% of those that use telehealth services want to continue receiving services in a virtual way beyond COVID. And so that speaks volumes, and we need to make sure that we invest in those modalities to be able to, increase access and provide different ways of giving care to individuals depending on where they are at the moment. Be a little bit more individualized in how we approach medicine. We are individuals and we all can't be treated in the same way. So let's be flexible about how we think about things. Let's be willing to try new things, and let's invest in healthcare with the small things as well as the large things.
I wholeheartedly agree. I think one of the important points that we're seeing with the current pandemic is the need to bring healthcare to where people are, and how that is helpful to addressing population health issues. I agree with Dr. Jones-Lopez that there is sort of short of providing, universal access, we are not going to see the substantial improvements in addressing these disparity issues that we like to see. But I think one place that healthcare is at least trying is sort of the space around capturing or measuring social needs in healthcare delivery. So attempting to figure out, what are the things that people are managing outside of the healthcare system that are potentially impacting their health. So things like food insecurity, transportation issues, housing insecurity, sort of addressing the social determinants or social factors that impact their health and behavior. The healthcare system cannot be responsible for poverty alleviation. That's just not going to be, it can't be the role of the healthcare system. But I think it's an incremental step in attempting to address the things that happen outside of the healthcare system that potentially impact health and health behavior.
Thank you. The next question that we have is, what efforts are being made to make underserved communities aware of resources that are available in the event they suspect a COVID-19 infection?
There is a huge public health campaign to make sure that you don't have to pay for testing, right? And so I think we have been part of Department of Health Services. We have been partnering with a lot of community testing sites to make sure that not only the people that we serve through our Department of Health Services, but also the surrounding community has access to testing if they feel that they are have symptoms consistent with COVID-19. So that is published on the LA Public Health website or the California Public Health website. If you Google, COVID-19 testing, you usually find a lot of sites that will be free of charge. Apart from that, Los Angeles County has provided a nurse access line. So I think you have to go through 211 to access it, and they are multilingual. So there's a lot of resources that are available to our patients, or to our community, I should say, to access testing. And then once the testing is done, the linkage to a provider is a little tougher.
Well, I want to make two quick comments. One is, I hate to disagree with my fellow panelists, but I do want to caution, and I don't know what Dr. Corrado thinks about this. I'm sure she's also seen patients with through video. And we at Tech actually, in county, we love the video option, but it really has a very specific role. It will never, hopefully, it will never replace a one-to-one interaction with a doctor. And it's a very dangerous, potentially dangerous solution if you want to apply it and in essence replace an interaction with a doctor. We are trained to not only obtain a physical history, but also to touch people and listen. And that part is key to really establishing not only a diagnosis, but also a relationship. After that initial evaluation is done, you could, once you make a diagnosis and you determine, you give a rational and safe treatment plan, you can follow that plan through video. But there's certain key moments in the interaction that it really has to be a one-to-one interaction. And that one-to-one interaction should happen, as Carmen suggests, in peripheral sites like community. So I would fight for more of those true quality interactions as opposed to, or the combination of those two things. Now, the other comment was about, and I forgot what it was, but it was about, oh yeah, and this is something that is very close to my heart, and it may come off as a bit strong, but I think it's very important. I always talk to my patients that one part, it will be me, the other part, it has to be the patient. The patient has to be involved with her or his or her care. They need to be aware of what they need to do. You cannot rely on me or the system or anybody else to really be safe and healthy. And I relate that to the question about what to do, particularly in a situation like the pandemic. There's a lot of different resources out there. As Dr. Corrado mentioned, many different resources through different media, internet, phone, Twitter, etc. I don't use Twitter or any of the social media ones, but I know they exist. So it really has to be personal. There's a level of personal responsibility of wanting to know what's going on with yourself. If you have symptoms, or even if before you have symptoms, there's a lot of literature you can read online. Try and look for that is true and based on science, as opposed to all of the different misinformation there's out there. No? But that part is key, really, and it's yes applicable to COVID, but it's also applicable to in general for your own health. No?
I think you make a really good point, Dr. Jones-Lopez, about the true and based in science, because there are a lot of resources out there, and having a provider who can direct you to useful resources, truthful resources is really helpful. We have about 4 more minutes, so I want to ask this final question to all of our panelists. And if you could identify one priority as the most important in any health equity strategy, what would that be? Carmen, would you kick us off?
Oh my goodness. One priority. Ooh, there are so many.
You have more than one. What priorities are most important in any kind of health equity strategy to improve health outcomes?
I mean, I think one of, and I've mentioned it, I think repeatedly, we really do have to be willing to invest in this. It's a long-term proposition that's been years in the making, right? And so we're not going to solve these issues overnight, but we all have to be willing to invest in this and be willing to open our minds into a different way of thinking, stepping in the other person's shoes. In other words, to understand what those issues are, what the barriers are for them to really get to a level of care that they deserve. And so we're doing a lot in the community health center world, for example, around trauma-informed care. And I think this then really becomes critical in understanding what are the issues that are preventing people from getting healthy. And those are I think the types of initiatives that we have to really focus on. And it's not the only one, but that's just an example of how something like that could really start to transform how we approach healthcare and looking at things from a different lens. And I think if we apply that same methodology or a similar methodology to issues of equity around race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, we'll begin to see a real change. And so I think that's really what my priority is to ensure that there is that investment from all of us, from in terms of making policy, in terms of putting dollars where it really counts. And so that's what I'm going with.
Dr. Corrado, what would be your priorities in a health equity strategy?
Right. Again, this is long-term strategy, right? Because I think, as we all know, nothing can be done short-term. I do think that having more representatives of community of color, of minority and vulnerable populations in all levels of healthcare, from policymaking to administrators, to the politicians, to physicians, will be necessary not only to create a system that is wonderful, but also a system that our communities of color actually want to access, right? Only because you build it, they may not want to come. But if we are building in our own communities and we're staffing these hospitals and we're creating these laws, hopefully our communities will say, okay, this was made for me, this is made with my people, I'm going to go. And that's what I'm sticking to.
Dr. Tucker-Seeley and Dr. Jones-Lopez, I'll let you two have the last kind of words about the priorities.
Okay.
So just, a minute left.
Yeah, so I have 2 points. So one, I think the point that was made earlier about, finding credible information. So I think issues related to health communication and health literacy, ensuring that there is a distinction between opinion and fact, and that accurate information is accessible by communities of color. And finally is the issue of ensuring that we are defining our goals similarly. That is, that we have the same definition of equality. A quote from MLK that I generally always do at the end of these kinds of talks is, this is a quote from MLK from 1967, where he said, "There is not even a common language when the term equality is used. Negro and white have a fundamentally different definition. Negroes have proceeded from a premise that equality means what it says and have taken white America at its word when they talked of it as an objective. But most in America in 1967, including many persons of goodwill, proceed from a premise that equality is a loose expression for improvement." And so I think it's important that for any health equity goal that we are clear and explicit in our definition of what we mean by equity.
Thank you.
Excellent. In my opinion, it's actually very easy. It's universal care. Universal care would, in essence, largely eliminate inequity in healthcare. This is a debate that is very necessary and important in this country, but is unique to this country. There is not a concept of inequity. There's better care, less better care, et cetera, in other countries. But inequity of care, a bit what Carmen Ibarra was talking about, some have the best of all cares available in the world, and others have zero care. That is what inequity is about.
Yes.
So it's an easy solution.
Universal access to care.
Yes.
We'll leave it at that. I want to thank you to all the panelists for sharing your stories and perspectives. I think the COVID-19 pandemic offers an opportunity to quantify all of these inequities that we see, and I'm confident that we'll be able to expand the evidence base and expand the practices and programs to ensure all patients receive the right care at the right time, especially in times of crises like the COVID-19 pandemic. So thank you all, and thank you to our audience for joining us today.
Thank you.
I'll echo what Yordanos just said, and on behalf of the BCLA team, we are super thankful for your time, for helping us engage our biotech community to bring about these important discussions and be more proactive about how we can all do a better part to be part of bridging the gap in access to healthcare. So one more thankful message to our sponsors to make the summit happen. So big thanker to our core sponsors as well, to the Bridge Institute at USC, Magnify UCLA, and the Bioscience LA nonprofit as well. And many thanks to everyone that joined us this afternoon. Thank you so much.
The novel coronavirus outbreak was an urgent call to action for the scientific community to develop a solution with unprecedented speed. From the very start of the outbreak, stem cell technologies has accelerated the pace of discovery for COVID-19 research. Our Canadian-made products have been used in the effort to develop vaccines and viral treatments. Stem Cell's cell culture product, Pneumocult, was used by the Chinese Center for Disease Control to isolate the novel coronavirus and determine its genetic sequence, a critical step towards developing a vaccine. Stem cell helped accelerate this early work on the virus by providing complementary products to COVID-19 researchers in China. To develop a treatment, researchers across the globe are actively identifying antibodies that could inhibit the virus. A key first step is to isolate the antibody-producing cells from patient blood. Scientists have used stem cells' EasySep cell isolation products to isolate the right cells for further analysis. Recently, Dr. Susan de Jong's team at Stem Cell collaborated with a researcher requiring custom tools for his work.
When a customer reached out to us because they were interested in isolating a very specific B cell subset, we were quickly able to respond and produce a custom cell separation kit that now forms an essential part of their workflow. So now they can move forward into clinical trials.
Identifying antiviral drugs to decrease COVID-19 infection is another active area of research. In a recent study, Dr. Josef Penninger at the University of British Columbia and a team of global collaborators used organoids as human tissue surrogates to identify a potential drug candidate. Organoids are three-dimensional miniature versions of organs grown in a lab from stem cells. Stem Cell Technologies is proud to be at the forefront in bringing this revolutionary technology to researchers around the world.
So I do believe organoids will be absolutely critical for this. And the research using them in COVID-19 will just explode, especially with our paper now.
For the study, Dr. Penninger collaborated with Dr. Ryan Conder at Stem Cell.
I think Stem Cell is very lucky because we interact with both the academic and clinical worlds so closely. When diseases such as this hit the world, we're really in a good position to have collaborative relationships with them. We're not competing with them, we're all working together to really find a solution as quickly as possible.
Collaborating with scientists around the world to speed up scientific discovery is something that Dr. Alan Eves, Stem Cell's founder, president, and CEO, is passionate about.
At Stem Cell, we're scientists helping scientists, and we work with collaborators all around the world to help make their science better and to help make the world a better place. Every day we are learning about new ways that scientists are using our products to research solutions for the COVID-19 pandemic. And we're actively working to support these researchers in any way we can.
We decided to partner with KGI for this project because we found the value in previous projects of leveraging the students' creativity and coming up with novel solutions that folks in the industry might not have thought of or addressed. It's a nice opportunity to kind of learn fresh ideas and have those brought to the table.
Students are very hungry usually, and they're very green in a good way because they're just learning and they can sort of think outside the box. They're very interested in learning, and I think that's the best part about having a very close relationship with a lot of the graduate students. You're able to pass on a lot of knowledge really fast and get their perspective.
All students work on bioprocessing here. We have a lot of projects in that field, and as a result, they should be able to apply that knowledge to those projects and so forth. So one of the reasons why we succeed on TMP is that our students come prepared to work on them.
From my perspective, I think the team does bring attributes to our institution in several ways. One, it's very interesting to see how the new professionals, how they approach projects. You know, it might be quite different than maybe Bill and I approach them. And every year, I must say, I especially learn something about technology that I'm not familiar with. So that's always a learning for me.
What is the most important thing when starting a new TMP project, I believe, is to have a good scope for your project, to have a good idea of what the end goal is and the final deliverable. I think the Team Masters project will be immensely helpful to our company because the resources that we were able to gather from the students and the market research in particular is something that will be useful to us not only for just this project, but going forward for other things that we may need to use it for.
I was introduced to the TMP project several years ago, working with other colleagues in other companies, but it was the first time that I had an opportunity to focus entirely on medical affairs-centric projects. I thought it would be great, the fact that we work in a small organization, it's our first company launch, and to continue building on the successes that I've had with other groups in the past. I've always been impressed of the smarts and the desire to learn from those students in the past, and I thought this is going to provide a tremendous level of opportunity to help go deeper in certain areas where we didn't have the bandwidth as we were building our teams in medical affairs. Our Chief Medical Officer had the opportunity to listen to some of the presentations when they came to visit. The data was well organized, meaningful, well summarized, to the point where this is something that we would like to continue in the years to come as an organization.
We would definitely consider hiring KGI students. We find them to be very high quality and some of the best trained students that I've seen out there.